Hi, Terrell. Do you need help with something?
No, I think I should be good. I am.
Okay, just checking. I mean, if
Yes,
if if it's not working, I can present from here. But let's try again and see.
yeah, because I'm in presentation mode, but is it not coming up on the screen? Yeah, are you
No, it's not coming up. It's just loading and loading.
okay? All right, let me try one more. Let me try a different way. All right, 1 second. I want to share. Yes, that. All right, so I will say, can you share the presentation? Because for whatever reason, it's not showing up on my end.
Okay, I can do that, Terrell. You need to stop presenting so I can present. Okay,
Yes.
1 minute.
So, for all the people who have joined, thank you for your patience as we are navigating the technical difficulties. We will begin in 1 moment. But I will say, if you are here in the chat, please put where are you tuning in from? It will be great to see that in the chat. Wow. So we got Texas, Colorado, we got Canada, Mississippi, Oregon, Chicago, Connecticut. Man, all of these great people. So I will say, so far, if you've been tuning in to the session so far, tell me what has been your favorite session of the day so far. Man, they people are very responsive in the ads. So Don Brolin is getting a lot of love. Ah, you know what, Donna? That is the perfect answer. All right. So thank you everyone for the patience so far. Had a little bit of technical difficulty, but this session is all about, processes and really overcoming inefficiencies, because that's something that all of us are facing, all of us have a challenge with. And to be honest with you, it's something that if you're running an accounting practice, something that all of your clients are probably having a problem with as well. So, the great thing about figuring this out for your own business is that then you can go actually help your clients, which just makes you even that much more valued by your clients and helps you build an even bigger and more profitable business. So, we can now let's take a look at what the agenda items are, just kind of what some of the things that we're going to cover in our session. So, the first thing that I really want to do is define a workflow, because this term gets used a lot and it gets thrown around in different contexts, different situations. But we really want to just come up with a simple explanation. And I will tell you is I prefer to keep things simple. I mean, because that's just how I understand things is when they are simple. I do not like to overcomplicate things. And maybe it's just because I have so many things that I have to keep up with that if it's not simple, I'm very likely to forget it or overlook it. So I like to keep things simple. So we're going to define workflows. And then also, we're going to identify the different types of workflows that a business can use, because there are different forms of workflows. Not all workflows are created equal, and not all workflows work for your business or for my business. And so we do kind of want to understand some context of the different types of workflows that exist. And then I want to leave you with about 7 tips that I have seen to be very effective and very helpful when it comes down to workflows. So, those are our agendas. That's what we're going to cover today. So, to give you a little bit of context, for those of you that may not know who I am, my name is Terrell Turner. I am a CPA by trade, started off in public accounting, worked in corporate finance. I work with multiple Fortune 500 companies, of helping them build out different processes, served as the finance leader for a couple Fortune 500 companies. And a lot of times, my job, both here in the US as well as down in Brazil and South America, was helping these Fortune 500 companies build processes and really make things a little bit more efficient from the accounting and the finance side. And I would say the experience that really taught me that was having to work with process engineers. And I don't know if any of you have ever had to work with engineers, but you have had to work, if you've had to work with process engineers, their entire job is to analyze processes. And I remember being in meetings where we were discussing how to remove 5 minutes out of a process so that we could increase our total output, which in at the moment it seemed like it was a very small thing, but when I did the math, I realized that 5 minutes was the difference between our company making about 300 million in revenue and the difference between making about 450 million in revenue, just because of the volume that we were doing. So very deep into understanding and studying processes. Now, as the CEO of the TL Turner Group, I do a lot of different things. I will say where I spend a lot of my time on is on marketing and really working with our customers, understanding their needs, and then going back to the team, helping them figure out how do we develop a process that allows us to deliver on these expectations that the clients have. And that is where I spend pretty much almost all of my time when I am not doing a podcast, creating more marketing content. So, process is where I spend a lot of time. Now, before we dive too deep into the different types of workflows, where I want to talk about a story, because I tend to look at a lot of things in history because I believe that history tends to repeat. So I came across this story about that something that happened back in 1867 in Chicago. And I was studying different businesses as they have used different processes. And there was one pretty interesting business back in the late 1800s in Chicago that most people probably never actually think about. But when I really looked into this business, I said, wow, this business was probably one of the first businesses or industry types to really revolutionize the way we think about workflows. Now, as I said, I was going to give you a simple definition of workflows. The simplest way that I can think about what a workflow is, it is pretty much the process of how work moves through a company. Now, this company that I was talking about is called the Swift Company. Now, what the Swift Company was it was a meat packing plant. And what the Swift Company did was they pretty much, they would go through the butchering process, they would package meat. Now, prior to 1867, what they did was they had a bunch of people who were specialists in different areas. And when you're a specialist in different areas, what tends to happen is things moved a lot slower. So, one of the things that they experimented with is, well, what if we assign a specific task to specific stations? And that way, people won't have to move from station to station doing their job. Is that person can focus on doing one job at this station, and then they can move the product down to the next person. Now, today we know that, or what we would call that, is an assembly line. But back then, no one had ever really thought about what an assembly line was. I mean, even if you think about, as productive as those companies were back then, I mean, no one had really experimented with really using an assembly line. And then later on in the early 1900s, Henry Ford popularized the assembly line methodology at massive scale. But this company was toying with this idea. And as you can see, when people have a set area that they're working on, what ends up happening is those individuals can become more proficient in what they are doing. Now, there are some challenges that come down when it comes to a assembly line and when it comes to a process like this, because what ends up happening is sometimes people do get bored, because if they're doing the same thing over and over, people do get bored. So there were some new challenges that they had to figure out when it came down to an assembly line. Now, that's not to take away any of the efficiencies that came with it, because it really did revolutionize the way things were made. It revolutionized not only the manufacturing industry or the meat packing industry, it revolutionized the manufacturing industry. It also revolutionized the way we think about so many other industries. I mean, even if you think about how you run your accounting practice. Now, I will say, put in the comments what type of services you offer, whether that's bookkeeping, whether that's tax, whether it's advisory or CFO services. However you describe it, put it in the chat, because I want to make this a lot more contextual to what you're doing. Um, and so when you think about your processes and you think about, what you're doing in your business. I mean, let's take, for example, bookkeeping. When it comes down to bookkeeping, there is a very clear process that you are following. Now, you may not have that process written down. You may not have had that process drawn out on a map, but there is a process that you're following when you are going through when you're doing the bookkeeping. I mean, and if you were to sit back and think about it and you would ask yourself, okay, all right, what are the steps that it takes to do this bookkeeping? Almost like if you were to sit back and create a recipe, one of the things that you would see is that there is probably a pretty consistent process that you are going through. Now, an exercise that we ended up doing in our company was, we said, what if we took the concepts of an assembly line and we applied it to our business? Because you do have a different options about what kind of workflows you want to use. You could use a specialist approach, which that's kind of what we were doing with our CFO work. We were using kind of a specialist approach where one person did probably 80% of the work. And I'm not gonna lie, it was a nightmare. It was very painful because I ended up being the person who was doing 80% of the work. And I said, all right, there's no way we can scale this. And so we took a step back and said, all right, the only way for us to really grow an even more profitable business, if we were going to take the specialist approach, is either we were going to have to really, really raise the prices of what we were charging, or I was going to have to go out and find a bunch of specialists or figure out how to clone myself and make a little bit of margin on that. And one of the things that I realized, I was like, okay, all right, that is not going to be realistic. So one of the things we looked at and said, okay, all right, what are some of the things that you would normally do in an assembly line? Because we wanted to look at that perspective. And what I said is, in an assembly line, one of the first things that I noticed as you start to study an assembly line is that an assembly line often brings clarity and organization. Because if you've ever seen an assembly line in action, one of the things that you'll notice is that let me say, if the facility you're watching in is fairly orderly and neat, what you'll notice is that it's very clear who's doing what part of the process. Because it's almost like you can look at the entire line and you can just look down and see, okay, all right, this person is doing that, this person is doing that. And then it's a lot more organized because all of the materials that that person needs to do their job are almost like right in front of them. I would say, can you go back to the last slide? Because in the last slide, if you're looking at that picture, one of the things that you can see is in that picture, you can see underneath the assembly line conveyor belt are all of the parts that that person needs to do their specific job. And this helped tremendously because it gave people a lot more organization to where they didn't have to stop the assembly line to go run around the building to find the parts, because everything you need to do this job at this station is going to be right in front of you. Now, the only way you can actually achieve something like that in your business is you first got to have a process, because one of the things that a lot of firms run into, especially those that do tax work, is when you're trying to go through and do a tax return and you spent maybe 15, 20 minutes on it, and then you realize, oh no, we don't have this document, we don't have this document, we don't have this document. Now you have to completely stop the process and you have to put it on hold, and then you got to go do whatever you need to do to go chase down these documents. And it's like, you know what if you had a better process where you can already make a request for those documents or collect those documents before you start working on that tax return? And that's just one example on like the clarity in the organization. The other factor was people, as I mentioned earlier, people became way more productive because when you only have one job to do, or when you only have one particular area to focus on, you can become a lot more productive. Now, for myself, I will say when I started the firm, I didn't have the luxury of having one job. I did everything from sales to marketing to client interaction to I was the accounting manager, I was the bookkeeper, and everything else that went on with the business. I was the IT department and everything else. And one of the things that I realized, I was like, you know what? I would be a lot more productive if I didn't have to do all of these jobs. And when I started really laying out the processes before I had anyone on my staff, what I said is, hey, while I'm the one doing the job, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to lay out this process and document and figure out what the heck am I spending my time on? And as I started laying out those processes, I realized like, hey, I could hire somebody to take these things off my plate, or I can hire somebody else to do this, or we can find a technology to do this for me. So that way I don't have to spend that much time on doing it. And what I realize is the more stuff that I took off my plate, the more productive I became. Now, one of the other things that a assembly line did in the manufacturing space is it also improved safety, because when you have a bunch of people running different directions trying to get documents or trying to get parts, I mean, you had a lot of accidents. Now, we may not necessarily have the same type of accidents in our business. When we're doing accounting and bookkeeping and tax and advisory and research, we may not necessarily have the same kind of physical injuries. But when you think about a conversation that I was having with a insurance provider, they provide, I guess, in errors and omission insurance for accounting firms. And one of the things that they were telling me is, you know what, one of the big risk areas that they find is firms that don't have really good processes tend to have more error claims filed against their company, which means their insurance policies are going to become more expensive, or eventually insurance companies will be like, you know what, your firm is too big of a risk that we're not going to insure you. And so when it comes down to accounting practices, if we don't have very clear processes, you are more likely going to make a mistake. And I will say, for the people that are doing tax work and CFO work, that when you get to that level, depending on the types of clients that you're working with, when you make errors at that level, you are likely to be sued for the errors, because the errors you make at that level may have a pretty big impact, which means if you don't have very clear processes, you could be setting yourself up for more headache. There's going to be a lot more risk of you making mistakes in that area. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about was the stress level. Now, one of the things that the accounting industry is facing is that it is difficult to find the right talent, find the right staff to support in your business. And one of the things you want to do is you want to make your workplace way less stressful. So having processes will make that a lot easier to achieve. Is to lowering the stress level, because when people don't have to guess about every single thing that they have to do during their day, then they're going to be a lot happier and a lot more productive. So you can go to the next slide. So as I talked about, these were some of the benefits of the assembly line. And so what I want to, and I've already defined what a workflow is. A workflow is just how the work moves through your business, the process that it follows. That is simply what a workflow is. Now, here are some benefits that I want to talk about, or tips that I want to talk about to help you develop, better workflows. So when it comes down to developing workflows, what I always tell people is think of it kind of like a recipe. Like if you told me like, hey, today I want to make, I want to cook something. The first thing I'm going to ask you is, okay, all right, what are we cooking? Like, what is the objective? What is the end product? Because the end product will determine what recipe and process we need to follow. Because if you don't tell me the right end product, I might design a process or I might pick the wrong ingredients, which means you're not going to end up with the right product. So, one of the first things that you need to do if you are trying to improve efficiencies and really implement workflows is you really do need to define your objective. What is the point? What are we trying to achieve? And then after we define what the objective is, then we could take a step back and say, okay, all right, what is the right recipe that gets us to that end result? Because if we don't have the right recipe, then you're probably not going to end up with the right end product. And then there are some recipes where you do have to do things in order. Now, I don't know how many of you are cooks or you cook often. Now, one of the things that we like to cook in my house are homemade Belgian waffles. And when I cook them, I usually cook them from scratch. And one of the things that I find out is you not only have to have the right ingredients, you actually have to mix them in the right order. Because if you don't mix the ingredients in the right order, your waffles are not going to come out perfect. They're not going to come out looking the way that they should. And so not only is it important for you to have the right ingredients, you also got to have the right order. So you can go to the next slide. Now, the next thing that I think is very important for you is really when it comes down to what I would call this is all about accountability. When it comes down to a process. See, the big thing that about when it comes to workflows is that if you don't really have accountability behind your workflows or behind your processes, what you'll find is that your process will look very pretty on paper or it'll look very pretty in the software that you're using. But if no one is following the process, you're not going to end up with a quality end product. So you do need some level of accountability. Now, here's how I think about the accountability. Is the first one is a method that a friend of mine would I hear her say this so often when she's talking to different clients or when her and I have taught at done different seminars together for different law firms. Is she calls it this, whenever we're assigning tasks and we're looking at workflows, she was like, who will do what by when. Whenever you are laying out a workflow, you need to be very clear about who is going to do what task and by when. What is the deadline? You need to know a who, you need to know what are they going to do, and you need to know when do they need to get it done. And not only do you need to know, they need to know, because if they don't have that clarity around what their expectations are, what you're going to find is they may not necessarily be efficient at all because they don't know the critical elements. So your workflows should not only lay out what needs to be done, you also need to clarify who's going to do what, and you need to clarify when do they need to get it done. And then you also want to have in checkpoints. See, one of the worst things you can do is assign tasks. You told who will do what, and you told them what the deadline is. but you don't have any checkpoints in. So you get to the day that everything is due, and then you find out at the last minute they didn't get the job done. That is not the situation you want for yourself. So you do want to build in checkpoints. And I will say, if you're a firm that is looking at expanding, and especially if you are using, staff that is offshore in different countries or different geographical regions that aren't very close to you, that you aren't interacting with on a day-to-day basis, I'm telling you, you definitely want to have in checkpoints, because sometimes what you'll find is that they may be getting stuck on something that you could probably help them get through it in like 30 seconds, but they're stuck on it and they're taking a lot longer than they should, but they may not necessarily know that this is something they can ask you about. But by building in checkpoints, what you can start to do is you can start to make sure that the process is being followed. And not only that, is you're helping your team develop and you're helping them stay efficient with the process that has been created. And also, sometimes you may find that you need to change something in the process. So those checkpoints give you time to get some feedback. And then the last part is accountability. Is you do need to get better at being able to hold people accountable, because after you've told them, hey, I need you to do this and I need you to do it by this point, you have the checkpoints. If they do not hit the deadlines or they do not follow the processes, you have to hold people accountable. Because one of the things that cause, workflows and processes not to be effective at all is there's no accountability. People don't recognize, or what they do recognize is that, hey, if I don't follow this process, nobody's going to say anything anyway. So you want to make sure that you have accountability in. Now, can you go to the last slide? Now, the last thing that I will say is it really comes down to this. You have to evaluate every workflow, every process. Is you have to ask yourself a very, very important question. Is after you have designed this pretty workflow, this pretty process, you have to go back to the very beginning where we said the first thing you do is you define the objective. You have to ask yourself, okay, all right, as I'm evaluating this process we have created, is this process actually adding value, or are we just running through tasks? Are we just wasting time? Because at the end of the day, every workflow you create, every process you create should be designed in a way to add value. And so if you aren't adding value, then you really need to take a step back and say, all right, do we still need to keep this process? Or are there things we should change in this process to make it valuable? You can go to the next slide. So, as you think about that, here's one that I think you should take a snapshot of this, take a picture of this if you don't already have a copy of the presentation. But these would be the tips that I think that will really guide you as you are trying to develop processes and as you are trying to really make things more efficient, is to really look at this and say, hey, how are we doing on all of these elements? All right, you can go to the next one. Now, I will say is when it comes down to workflows, having the right tools will be very, very important. So, one of the things that I would definitely advise you to do is, check out tools like Financial Sense. If you don't already have a tool, or maybe you do have a tool, it may be good to just check out what are the features in their tool, and how can you navigate setting up your workflows? How can you look at using workflows to really help you improve the way your business performs and the way your business runs? And you can go to the next slide. And so I do want to say is thank you all for tuning in, and thank you so much for your patience as we began in the beginning. So if you have any questions, I will try to do them very, very fast. All right. So, what is the best way to minimize? So, one question that came in is, what is the best way to minimize employee stress? Okay. That is a very loaded question, but here's my very quick answer. I think the best way to minimize employee stress is, I think you have to take the time to see your employees as people. which means there's not going to be a one size fits all answer, meaning you're going to have to invest a little bit of time and energy to understand who are the people you hired and understand what is causing them stress. Because I think as you invest that time and you start to understand what may be causing them stress, because what causes one person stress may be very different from what causes another person stress. And as you start to understand that, you got to be honest enough with yourself to say, okay, all right, is this something we can change? Because if it is something that you can make a change on, you can make a tweak to actually improve the work environment, then great. But if what is causing them stress is something that is essential to them doing their job, maybe you got to be honest with them and say, hey, maybe this isn't the right position for you, or maybe this isn't the right company for you. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think once you invest the time to really get to know them as a person and really understand them, you'll be able to better figure out how to minimize stress for them. So I hope that answered your question. All right, let's go with the next one. All right. So, with the idea of the assembly line in the bookkeeping industry, would that mean one person doing data entry, AR, AP, etc., or one person per file entirely? So, I would say if you were trying to draw the direct correlation between an assembly line and the bookkeeping, it would look a lot like your first example, where there's one person that does data entry, one person that does AR, one person that does AP. Now, in a ideal world, maybe you can do that. Now, what I will say is you're probably not going to have a very purely assembly line approach. What I would say is you're probably going to have elements of assembly line. Like, for example, in our company, one of the things that we set it up is we have a bookkeeper who does the bookkeeping. We have a senior accountant who does the review. And then the senior accountant does the initial review. If there's something the bookkeeper needs to address, they mark it or they identify it, they send it back to the bookkeeper. The bookkeeper does the update, sends it back to the senior accountant. They do their review, and then it moves on to the accounting manager for the final review before it goes to the client. So it is not a purely straight assembly line, but it's assembly line in nature. All right. So the next question is, what is the process you think makes the biggest instant impact within your organization? The biggest process I think for us, I think, was getting a accounting management system. We were doing it a lot manually. It was in spreadsheets, it was in Word documents or Google Docs or Google spreadsheets. But transitioning to using a accounting management system was a game changer for us, because then people didn't have to look in 15 different places to find out what the process was, who was going to do what, and what the deadlines were. Using a system was probably the biggest game changer for us. Okay, how do you determine where to focus time on processes that will increase the bottom line? All right, so one of the things that I learned in working in manufacturing was this thing called value chains. And what we would do with a value chain is you would write out the entire process, and then you would start to ask yourself, okay, all right, which steps in the process add the most value to the end product? And one of the things that we did, even in our accounting firm, is I would list out the entire process that we were doing for doing bookkeeping. And then I would take a step back and say, okay, all right, which ones add the most value to the client? Because that's really what the client feels like they're paying for, is the value we deliver. And if it didn't add value to the end product, I would say, how do we either take that out of the process, or how do we change that or enhance that so it could add more value in the process? So it is a little bit of a tedious process to figure that out. But I think when you lay the process out and you start asking yourself more questions like, which steps actually add the most value? Whichever ones don't, how do we move it or change it? So I hope that answered your question. All right, I think we are at time. So thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to Ryan Lazanis' session that is coming up next. Thank you all for tuning in.